Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Washburn, and I'm the Health Beat Leader on Firearm Violence and Trauma for AHCJ. This webinar is one of a series of topic-specific training opportunities to brief health journalists on the latest information in a particular health area and to give you story ideas and story resources you can use in your work. Today's topic is about a recent gun violence prevention certification workshop that was held by the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. The day-long training explored best practices for reporting on firearm violence and prevention. Participants included 25 journalists and 15 community-based gun violence prevention experts. We're going to talk about the work that they did with this workshop, as well as this just being a general movement toward the type of reporting that I write about and that we focus on with the firearm violence and trauma page for AHCJ. So joining us today will be Jim McMillan, the founder and director of the Initiative for Better Gun Violence Reporting, and Alana Bookman, a violence prevention reporter for AL.com and a participant in the workshop. So what I'd like to do is pass it off to Jim and Alana to introduce themselves more. Alana, would you like to go first? You're muted.
All right, thank you. My name is Alana Bookman. I am a Report for America Corps member, and I report on violence prevention with AL.com. And I did want to start by saying AL.com collaborates with two other local newsrooms. That's CBS 42, which is a local TV station, and Birmingham Times. And they report on Black Birmingham news. And we have an overarching project that focuses on Beyond the Violence series that kind of steps beyond episodic crime reporting and into highlighting and discussing solutions for violence prevention. And a big part of that is violence prevention for gun violence. And pretty much AL.com created the violence prevention beat for our newsroom because Birmingham is experiencing homicide crisis like a lot of other cities across the nation. Birmingham's population is about 200,000. And in 2022, there were 144 homicides, and about 13 of those homicides were unfortunately children. In 2023, there were 135 homicides, and about 8 of them were children. So that was the first drop in about 5 years. So there's obviously a really big problem there, and we are hoping to highlight some of those solutions. The city of Birmingham so far has invested millions of dollars into violence prevention, especially among youth. And the school systems are working with courts to bring in counselors to discuss nonviolent conflict resolution. And there are a lot of community members that I've talked to personally who have dedicated their lives to reducing violence. So I think that there, of course, is always going to be a lot to report on, and I'm hoping that we can continue bringing those solutions to our community.
Thank you, Elena. And I think I mispronounced your name in my introduction. I apologize. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Jim, I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Caitlin, and thanks so much, everybody. So my name is Jim McMillan. I'm the founder and director of the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. We launched in the summer of 2020. In the middle of all that, it was just me at first, and now that we've got a staff of 4, a dozen or so regular contractors, and 150 people that we've supported in various ways to work with us. Community representative, journalists, researchers, and others. My mission at launch was to explore the hypothesis that changing the way that journalists and news organizations report on gun violence might actually prevent shootings, and save lives. And that's still an interest and a pursuit. But our research collaborative, which I'll talk a little more about later, has done a lot of work that's helped us refine or expand really the possibilities of the kind of differences we could make by identifying harmful reporting practices and alternatives. And so we've refined our mission to say that we're collaborating to advance more empathetic, ethical, and impactful reporting on gun violence and prevention. I always like to start these sessions by saying, we see the good reporting, we see the best reporting, we see the solutions reporting, the evidence-based reporting, the community-informed reporting. And whatever sort of reporting you might be doing, we know it's hard work. I was in the field for a very long time, and so were many others on our team. And so we see the good work, but we also see what I guess we'd contend is mostly harmful reporting, episodic reporting, incident reporting that has some harmful effects that we'll talk about, and we'll talk about the alternatives. And this is just not us pontificating. This is based on widespread anecdotal feedback, really over 5 years of work, although we only launched the center 3.5 years ago, and really 40 years of anecdotal experience for me, but also peer-reviewed academic research that we can talk about as well. The problem in a nutshell with reporting is most of the harmful reporting we see is that, there's fear mongering, but it also, it diminishes the public health response to reporting. It creates a false efficacy of law enforcement and criminal justice as a solution to gun violence. It doesn't generally address underlying root or systemic causes or solutions or evidence-based solutions. And that, ends up blaming the victims and not the systems that we need to address in order to make a difference. So we're not out here to tell anybody they're doing it wrong. We know that it's very hard work, and we try to provide some information to help them do better. Okay, so the next thing I have to say, I don't know if you want me to turn to this or hold for a moment, Caitlin, but just to make it interesting, I delivered my deck for this webinar about 30 seconds before we went live. I don't know if that's available now. I could, and here it is. So if that works for you, I could scroll through that pretty quickly. Caitlin, is that a good next step? Okay, so just to introduce you to the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting, we're online at pcgvr.org. We're not hard to find. That's our homepage. Coincidentally, there's a terrific webinar on the home. Well, this is a screenshot from a couple of days ago, so you might have to scroll down a little. But there's a terrific webinar on our homepage, also moderated by Caitlin, organized by the National Press Club last week. And that's our research director, Dr. Jessica Beard, who I'll talk more about at top right. Okay, next, I'll say. So we have 3 core programs. One is the Credible Messenger Reporting Project, a community reporting project, which pairs people with extensive lived experience and more advanced professional journalists to report together on root causes, lived experience, and possible solutions. These are photos from our Credible Messenger Film Festival, where we screen all the productions. This was our second one, and we'll have a third one this year. Next, please. And I also want to point out that our Credible Messenger reporting, well, the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting was awarded was recognized as non-traditional news provider of the year by Philadelphia's Press Club, the Pen and Pencil Club, last year. And we provide a lot of other services and resources on our site, but our only original reporting is the community reporting. And here are a couple of our other Credible Messengers, POC and Kim Kamara. Thank you. Next. We also have an incredible interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research collaborative. It's led by Dr. Jessica Beard. She's a trauma surgeon and public health researcher at Temple University Hospital here in Philadelphia. She cares for firearm injured patients every day and night that she works, but also studies gun violence prevention and the role of the media. We've got one study published, several others in progress. At top left is Professor Jennifer Midbury of Lehigh University, a journalism professor who also taught at the workshop we're here to talk about. Next. And I was going to talk here a little bit about the study we released so far, or the first study that we published last year. The part of the title is Like I'm a Nobody, Firearm Injured People's Perspectives on Gun Violence Reporting in Philadelphia. And the shorthand is that people affected by gun violence when interviewed in qualitative research studies reported that coverage of episodic coverage of incidents of gun violence left them feeling scared, hopeless, and dehumanized, that it did harm to their reputation, that it put them in physical danger, and did other harms. Maybe we can talk about that more, but that's our first study. Next. And a photo from that meeting. After community reporting and research collaborative, we also have an extensive professional development program. If you think about community reporting, the intent there is to transfer power to people with lived experience. When it comes, and there are some intersections in the community, of course, but when it comes to professional development, we're more often focused on well, most of the people who report on gun violence, like me at one time, aren't from the communities that they're covering, don't often represent the communities that they're covering. So we try to help people already reporting on gun violence, people already in power, to do better, by building relationships, earning trust, getting connected in the community, and learning more from that perspective. Among those programs, this is our panel at the ONA conference last year in Philadelphia. Next. This was our reception the night before, and I include this was at the Pen and Pencil, the Phillies Press Club. And of the 1,000 or so people that went to ONA, 100 came to our reception. And I always show this just to sort of share the intensity and energy we have around this topic. We have there's a great deal of interest in this work across the profession. There are a few people who we meet a few resistors, maybe 20% like really engaged allies who've been looking for just what we're doing. And the other 80%, if the math were, whatever the math adds up to, very interested, just generally want to do better. Thank you. Next. We're getting there. And this is what we're here to talk about today. This is our most recent event, the Better Gun Violence Reporting Certification. No, I'm sorry, I misspeak sometimes. The Gun Violence Prevention Reporter Certification Workshop that we held in November. And I can come back and talk about the instructors. And this is Professor Yvonne Laddie. Two of the other instructors were in the last slide. This is Professor Yvonne Laddie, Director of the Logan Center for Urban Investigative Reporting here at Temple University. That's where I am today. And I worked for her at the Logan Center, and the Logan Center and PCGVR have collaborated on a great deal of this work. Next. I just always like to show that we do a lot of outreach. Last year we had 35 events, some virtual, but more and more in person with ONA and NABJ, and we've been to Harvard and Penn, and we zoomed into 27 newsrooms thanks to a Pointer Institute class, and you can see the others. Thank you. Next. Coming up, or no, just getting started, we have a new collaborative documentary, The Second Trauma, focusing on harmful reporting and better alternatives from the community perspective, and maybe I can talk more about that, but you can find The Second Trauma at secondtrauma.net or on our homepage, and maybe we'll come back to that. Thanks. And then I think there's one more slide, which is about, I think this is the cover of the near final draft, but I think the final draft that we'll publish soon is will be called our Better Gun Violence Reporting Toolkit. And as it says, it's a toolkit for minimizing harm in episodic stories. And we can talk about all of those things. I feel like I've been talking too long, and maybe I'll cut here.
Thank you, Jim. Now this is, I wanted you to get into that with this group, because for the work I do on this page and for AHCJ, I come to your site all the time and the resources that you put out. And so I'm glad for people to learn more about what y'all do and what resources you have out there. You're a wonderful source. So, but yeah, let's get into the workshop. And, when I heard about it, and this was like late last year, I was really struck by it, and I was curious to learn more, just like what went into developing this workshop. Why is a certification needed, or why is it something that like should be more widely available? But we'll get into kind of some of that other stuff I just mentioned. But Jim, talk to me about what went into developing this workshop, and what you and your organization were thinking about. What did you really want people to take away?
Okay, and then I promised to stop talking for a while after that. But, sorry for these coming back to back. But so if you break it down a little bit, right? Gun Violence Prevention Certification Workshop. Well, first of all, I spend a lot of time every day curating gun violence and prevention news. And when you see gun violence, it's almost in the headline, it's almost always a thematic report, a story about the issue and often solutions, rather than stories about shooting, police, homicide, and so on. So that's why we focus on gun violence. Prevention is important for a couple of reasons. It's at the core of the public health response to understand that gun violence is preventable. No other advanced nation in the world suffers gun violence anything like the United States. So prevention is critical, but it's also to focus on prevention rather than focusing on the violence is also at the core of some best practices in sort of specialized disciplines of journalism, such as in solutions journalism. We focus on solutions such as prevention, not the problem. or in peace journalism, I had the opportunity to study and teach and try to practice peace journalism about a decade ago when I was at Swarthmore College. And it's a discipline designed around recognizing that reporting on war and civil conflict are one of the rare instances where we focus on news with a negative bias, right? We have health desks and business beats, not illness desks and bankruptcy beats. But when it comes to war and violence, we focus on the negative, on war, not on peace. And so and whenever I talk about it, somebody would inevitably raise their hand and say, "Couldn't you apply?" Not knowing my background in the area, couldn't you apply all of this to the crime beat? So that's why we're focused on prevention. That's why we're focused on gun violence rather than gun violence rather than shootings, prevention rather than violence. And then certification was really very much an experiment, as you might imagine. I attended another conference on a similar topic, and at the end of it, much to my surprise, they handed me a certification for attending the course. And I was excited about that, and I shared it on social media, and it's among the certifications on my resume. And I thought, hey, maybe we've been gathering some pretty important people for about 5 years. Maybe we have the influence to provide certification. So it was an experiment, and lots of people turned up. So it's a pilot project of something we plan to expand. So it was local, mostly local. And so we had 20 local journalists from almost every Philadelphia news organization involved. We also bring in community partners on everything we do, as you saw in the photos. And we had 15 community representatives, and then we invited, I think, and supported 4 or 5 journalists from around the country to join us. But I guess their attendance is the proof of concept in terms of planning next steps.
Thank you, Jim. Elena, I want to hear from you just as from the participant side of this day. Tell me about how it went, what stood out to you. Just kind of walk us through the day of what you learned, and then, and what you heard from other folks, throughout. Just kind of give us a sense, to walk us through what happened.
Absolutely. So I don't exactly remember in what order the day went, but I do remember, of course, what stuck with me. And I believe we started the day off as journalists discussing if the crime beat did more harm than good. And though I am fairly new to my beat and reporting, that was something I've never heard discussed, is if a beat does more harm than good. Not in school and not in my newsrooms that I reported in. So I think that definitely set the tone for what we were going to be discussing that day. And later on, we also heard from some expert voices. So there were gun violence survivors as well as secondary victims who were able to tell firsthand just how harmful some of the episodic reporting was after they were shot themselves or had a loved one shot or and died from gun violence. And I think that definitely helped to widen my eyes about how large of a problem this is and how much it may affect people. In Birmingham, I am not originally from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm from Dallas, Texas. And so I had to fly in and take a lot of time to get to know the people who I was reporting on and get to know my community. And one thing that was jarring was that a lot of people, almost everybody I talked to, including children, have a story of losing someone to gun violence, being shot, or knowing someone who's been shot. And so that workshop definitely gave me some insight in how to engage with people who are survivors and who are secondary victims. And that was extremely important to me and my beat and how I decided to move forward with it. We also heard from health professionals. I know Jessica Beard was in the room, and she gave us a lot of really incredible insight on something that has been talked about for a while in the violence prevention and gun violence space, just about treating gun violence like a public health disparity that we're seeing across the nation. And I think that that's also really helpful in understanding that episodic crime reporting and spewing really big crime numbers at communities isn't helpful. Or isn't very helpful. It could be a lot more helpful by doing things like presenting solutions and prevention. And I think, let's see, I know that we also discussed towards the end just ways that we as journalists, with what we've learned from the day, could take back to our newsrooms. And of course, being able to discuss it in a space that was open of judgment, where I was able to just free of judgment, where I was able to ask questions, was also incredibly helpful. And so, like I said, as somebody who is not from my community, I learned just different ways to be a member of my community, attend vigils where the community was invited, not as a reporter, but as somebody who was a community member and who was grieving with my community. Giving grace to victims and secondary victims. A lot of episodic crime reporting doesn't necessarily hold up that idea of not shoving a camera in a grieving mother's face. And just understanding, especially from the people that we were able to hear from at the training, that these secondary victims, these survivors, are spending their entire lives healing and recovering. And we as journalists can give them the grace and space that they deserve to process that and to tell their own stories in their own time. And with that being said, I think the biggest advice that I was able to take away from that webinar was just letting those people within those communities be the leading expert in my stories, and letting things like numbers kind of be the secondary leading voice, as opposed to or in place of having somebody tell their own story. So I learned a lot, and I was able to take a lot back to my newsroom. And I really also love to share some of the stories that I was able to kind of reform and use that advice in as well.
Oh, I definitely want to hear more about those. But going back to something you said real quick that I think is really important, and why, and just what struck me about a certification workshop is it's about best practices, and you know, talking about like, yeah, understanding who the experts are and who the people that we should be going to on this topic are, not just the police narrative, and not just like you, I think your point too, just like instead of just like saying numbers, like where's the humanity behind these numbers? You know, for the other journalists that were in the room, were they learning a lot as well? Was this like, you know, kind of talk about like, this was about learning best practices. What were the other participants thinking? What were they like? What were your discussions like around this? Were people surprised? Were people like, I already do this? Or like, or was it a kind of somewhere in between?
I think I was in an interesting position because most of the other reporters there were from Philadelphia, where gun violence is always going to be a topic of discussion. They were also older journalists, and they had, I think, a bit more to contribute to the discussion than I did, which I love to sit back and be a listener and learn. But I think one of the interesting things that I heard from one of the newsrooms, and I'm so sorry, I can't remember which one, they discussed, because one of our survivors that were invited to talk to us about how the reporting that she had on her son was harmful, discussed how in stories following, a lot of them were putting her in a position where they were very triggering, the stories that she was reading on either her son or just gun violence in general. And so I know that one of the reporters shared with me about how they put resources into their own story, resources for grieving parents, resources for those who may actively be involved in a violent situation, was such a small and easy way to make their coverage more responsible. And so that was something I definitely took from one of the other journalists who was able to take what they heard in the workshop and apply it to their own reporting. And I was able to use that and apply it to my own reporting. And I think that kind of collaboration in that workshop space was really, really great for being able to do it, like I said earlier, just very openly without judgment, and taking the time to really implement it into my own newsroom.
That's such a good point. And I think when we talk about covering gun violence in a more responsible way and doing this work, like I think it can feel daunting, and it can seem like, oh my gosh, we're talking like the panel discussion I hosted last week, there was a lot of talk about like this is like a generational moment, and like that's like the shift that we are seeing, and what needs to be done around this topic and how we need to do better. But like it can just be little things. It can just be like putting resources in. It can just be doing a little bit more to provide that context, or to give people something that they can actually use from the story. Like that does not take much time as a reporter. And, you know, if the benefit is there for the community, then thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really important point. Jim, I want to hear, you know, you just heard wonderful feedback about how the day went, but, you know, I'm curious what you wanted journalists and other people in the room to take away from this workshop. And then if you've gotten any feedback like the day of or since then that you'd like to share. You're muted.
I warned you that I do that. Thanks so much, and thank you, Elena, for that breakdown. That's just priceless and incredibly helpful. And thanks again for joining us. Yeah. So we have sort of a few layers of feedback. But it also listening to Elena, it also reminded me that maybe it would be helpful to take a moment and just kind of break down a little more specifically the curriculum. So, I had this idea about certification, and our researchers actually are, they're incredibly rigorous. And it was brainstorming with first Dr. Beard and then Professor Midbury that led us to the curriculum we developed. And Midbury actually, developed the specific, pedagogy for the day. And we have 4 sessions just to break it down. And I don't remember the order either. But we had a session on solutions reporting. The Solutions Journalism Network has designed this whole. I mean, journalists have always reported on solutions, or sometimes have reported sometimes on solutions, but forever. And the Solutions Journalism Network has developed a curriculum, and Midbury kind of introduced that. Professor Laddie from here at Temple, who I mentioned, is like me. We're both former fellows of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia, and she talked about the principles of trauma-informed reporting. Dr. Beard, as Elena mentioned, talked about the public health response, which was incredible. And maybe we can talk about that more, but was, I think, exceptional because, it's so rare that a lot of people sort of throw around, we need to take a public health response, but never break down what it is. And she broke it down in scientific detail, right? And then the 4th session was Manny Smith, who is the homepage editor at Yahoo News, but also was most recently the managing editor at CBS3 here in Philly, and had worked at least one other local TV news station. And he's a Philadelphian. Talked about how to take these practices back to work and inspire others, and meet people where they're at, and how to implement this work and address impediments. In terms of feedback, that day there was so much energy, but this is sound level after our gatherings is always remarkable. And some people thought we needed much more. It was really challenging. Some people thought we needed a longer day. Some people thought we should spend 2 days there. But of course, it's a long day full of traumatic content. So we're still not sure. But we heard more. We got more signals that people wanted more than less. I'll tell you that. They wanted more time for the interactive sessions in between. So we had that thanks to Midbury, we had interactive sessions between all of the presentations, and maybe those felt a little bit hurried. And then we had a survey that I just saw the results of. Somebody transcribed all of them for us, and I'll just share her breakdown. She said, number one, everybody loved Dr. Beard's presentation, and Dr. Beard is priceless, of course, but I think it was especially valuable because you don't get that elsewhere. Everybody wanted to have more time and more small group activities, as I said. A lot of the people thought the space was too small, and that's on me. It's challenging. Suddenly, after 40 years in journalism, I'm an event manager and a program manager, and it's challenging. We wanted an intimate space, which we got, and a safe space, of course. And it was in a historic house in an arboretum and green and peaceful. But it's difficult to calculate how many people attrition, how many people who register might actually turn up. In this case, of the 40 people who registered, 39 turned up, and another person who turned up brought a colleague. So we actually got to plug him in. So I didn't expect to have as many people as we had, but that speaks to the energy and lesson learned. And it's a funny thing. I think sometimes if a space is a little overcrowded, it can add to the energy and enthusiasm. If it's way overcrowded, it can feel broken. And we got a little close to that. So lesson learned: when people sign up for these programs, maybe they're really going to show up. And then people love the food. Sounds like a joke, but that's really important to us. It's stressful and traumatic, and we want people to feel comfortable. So we always make sure the food's good. But overall, they felt it was valuable. Wish they had more space to breathe. And I've got 40 other reviews that I want to read more closely, but that's the summary for now.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And I want to just remind people who are listening, like, you can be dropping in questions. We'll have some time for any questions that come in, but there's a Q&A feature here on Zoom where you can stick those questions. We'll definitely make some time for that at the end of our chat. And as a reminder, this is also being recorded, and there will be a copy available later if you don't catch all of it, if you have to hop off or want to come back to it later. Just want to remind folks of that. Elena, I want to go back to something you mentioned, and I said I'd bug you about it, but I want to hear some specifics that you've taken back to your reporting and to your newsroom. So talk us through that.
Absolutely. So at the time of the workshop and the training, I was actively working on one of our bigger stories that really, it was extremely collaborative. It was one of the stories that we had worked on with Birmingham Times and CBS 42, and it was one of the biggest ones I'd done in my newsroom so far. And it was about how siblings were going through the stages of mourning their brother who had died from gun violence. And I was about in the middle of reporting for that story. And I was able to actively go to that workshop and then come home and transform or just kind of readjust how I was reporting, how I was approaching people, how I was utilizing community resources and community voices in this story and letting them take the lead. And so one of the big things that, of course, all journalists learn is that you need a good expert voice to bring, I guess, cohesion to a story. And one thing that I was able to do is honestly kind of put that expert voice, so law enforcement, doctors, psychologists, I was able to kind of put that voice toward the back of the story, if you will, to make sure that the voices of those secondary victims, these siblings, were the number one impactful voice in the story. Being able to listen to those secondary survivors during the workshop talk about how harmful episodic reporting was for them, not being able to tell their own story, learning through friends or family members that there was a report going out about them or about their family member and how harmful that was. I was able to go, like I said, back to these siblings and talk to them about how they would like to present themselves and how they would like to present their family members, their brothers, in that story. And I think that was really helpful in making sure that the coverage, that once it was out, did the least harm possible. And then also at the end of that story, I was able to put in resources for grieving parents, grieving brothers, grieving sisters who had lost somebody to gun violence. And I think that was extremely special and a real turning point in the way that I was deciding to do this violence prevention reporting. There's also another story that I was able to work on, and it wasn't something that was really on my radar, but like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of children who are unfortunately being impacted by the violence in Birmingham. They are probably the most impacted group because they're seeing it, and unfortunately they are experiencing it firsthand. And I was able to utilize my resources that I built up over time to go into the schools and talk to these teenagers. They were high school age children who were more informed than you could ever imagine. And they were talking to me about the solutions that they would like to see the city put together, their communities, their schools. And that was, I think, for me, less about putting a story together and more about going into my community and being a part of my community and listening to those who have real solutions and have real experiences that should be, I think, valued a bit more than big numbers, big drawing numbers, or somebody who has not experienced gun violence or violence firsthand. But yeah, that was all, I think, something that I was able to do because of the workshop, and I'm really grateful for it.
Thank you for sharing that, and especially the bit about the last story too. Like, I think we forget about the survivors and we forget about people who live with it all day, and that makes it more the people. We should obviously be talking about people who die, but like the people who are impacted by it and survive, they go on to deal with lifelong consequences. And they also have more to their story than just being survivors of gun violence or living in an area that has a lot of violence. There's more to these people than just like with anyone in the world. Like there's much more going on there. Was there anything kind of when you went back and talked to your editors about how you approach your reporting or about how your newsroom in general approaches covering violence, were there any changes or maybe not necessarily changes, but just what were those conversations that you took back from this workshop as far as maybe restructuring coverage or doing something better or doing something less of something?
Absolutely. I think I actually remember talking to another reporter. She's also part of Report for America, at the workshop about how I was a little bit scared to go back to my newsroom and talk to my editor about some of the things that I learned in the workshop. But thankfully, my editor, Ruth Servant at AL.com, she was very gracious in taking in what I had learned. It was actually probably the first thing we talked about that Monday when I got back was what did I learn from the workshop and how can we implement it in not only my reporting, but in our crime reporter, in our education reporting. And I think that that was one of the things that I wasn't expecting was my editor being so open to implement this like gun violence prevention reporting into so many other beats across the newsroom. And I think she definitely took all of this advice that I'd learned to heart. And we were able to go in and talk about it during our education lab meeting and in our overall like big newsroom meeting so that we could make sure that some of these resources were implemented in stories across the board. Because I think in Birmingham, especially, in every single beat, there is somebody who's impacted by gun violence, whether it's the education beat, of course, the crime beat, the state beat, it's all there. So I think that she definitely was able to implement some of those suggestions that I learned during the workshop, whether it be about resources or putting those survivors' voices first.
That's so heartening to hear because that's one thing I talk to other reporters in this space about often is getting leadership on board. You know, us reporters can talk about what we want to do all the time, but until the leaders, until management is for it, it's tough to pull it off. So I'm glad to hear your editor was on board. I've got one more question for you guys before we move on to our Q&A, but thank you again. And a reminder to folks listening, there's the Q&A feature at the bottom where you can drop some questions that I'll direct to our panelists. You know, Jim, going forward, how you kind of mentioned that folks were interested, they were left wanting more, a few folks, they wanted a longer day, they wanted more, you know, how do you want to replicate this? Do you want to do more of these certifications? You know, how do you want to build this out so more folks around the country can access this work?
Sure. Thank you for asking. First of all, I just want to take a moment and say thanks again, Elena. As everybody here knows, maybe everybody listening knows, you know, this is hard work and emotionally challenging and demanding, and the reaffirmation I'm feeling from this webinar is priceless and is fueling me. So thank you. So looking ahead, our plan was that the fall workshop was a pilot for a national conference, something we've been planning for a while. We had a national before. It was during my fellowship before we launched the Oh, I don't know if I mentioned that. That was in before we went live. I started creating some of the foundation of this project during a fellowship at the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri in 2019. And it was during that fellowship we held a national conference. We called it the Better Gun Violence Reporting Summit in Philadelphia. And then it was in November 2019. And as you might recall, then there was a pandemic that moved most of our operations virtual for a long time. And then we started having, this was our second live workshop. The first one was a little larger, but a little less advanced as well. But this is our first national conference since the pandemic. And we heard the feedback. People will have more room and we've got to figure out more time. I mean, if people want more time, well, there'll be more expense to staying 2 days if they come to Philadelphia, for example. It will be in Philadelphia in the fall. We're debating whether to try to have sort of a parallel summit, have a speaker series as well as a certification workshop, and whether to do them, back to back or concurrently. And so we've got a lot of work to do, but there will definitely be a national certification conference here in the fall. I'd take a wild guess and say maybe September. We also try to advance this work through all of our other events and programs. And then another thing, just an idea we've kicked around a little bit so far, in the spirit of individual certification, is maybe newsroom certification. But that we're just in the earliest stages of talking about that. But the national conference is next.
Awesome. Ooh, I'm excited to hear more about the thoughts on the newsroom certification. That would be really cool. Elena, kind of the same question to you, but and you mentioned this just a bit ago, and I think it's really important. This issue touches not just the quote unquote crime beat or your beat. It touches all parts of the newsroom. So, what would be the value of journalists from all kinds of beats getting certified in this way and learning these best practices?
It's really, I think there's a huge benefit to it. Of course, when we did the initial workshop, it was violence prevention and crime reporters in the room. But I think it'd be really incredible to have education reporters, to have state reporters, to have public health reporters in the room as well, because I think of what Ms. McMillan said earlier about prevention being possible. It's extremely possible to prevent the gun violence that we're seeing, especially here in Birmingham. And there are so many people in so many different fields who are working on it. I collaborate with our education lab at AL.com. And a lot of their reporting is about conflict resolution in schools and about how they're working with the court system. It is all extremely intersectional, and I think it would be really beneficial to have entire newsrooms in the room during these workshops. I think it'd be very beneficial to have that certification.
Thank you. And thank you both again for joining us today and having such insightful thoughts to these questions. We've got a question that has come in that is for you, Jim. Have you ever felt like you're not breaking through to people in daily journalism with, especially around TV and daily reporting as far as broadcast goes? Or are you seeing new faces at these events and are you feeling like a movement is building kind of across mediums?
Okay, so I'll try to be concise. I could go on all day about this. We have people who object, and we listen to them and we learn from them and we care about them. But mostly, all signs point to an unstoppable movement. In Philadelphia for a while, just a few things that I've been close to in recent years. Of course, Caitlin, you were on the Missouri Solutions Project at the Kansas City Star for a couple of years, which I would suggest might have really been a gun violence prevention reporting program. But certainly a more advanced, demonstrated more advanced practice of journalism. In Philadelphia for a while, WHYY Public Radio had 2 gun violence prevention reporters. They don't right now, but I do know somebody who mentioned applying for the position. So I think they may be hiring or maybe just had a position open recently. There were just in more and more conferences like the radio RTDNA, the Radio, Television and Digital News Association had, well, they called it a crime reporting summit here in Philadelphia a month ago, but they had us and a few other really, I think, forward-thinking speakers and organizations on the program. Of course, there was the American Healthcare Journalist Conference in Chicago maybe a year and a half ago, where Dr. Beard presented. I think I might have moderated a panel with you, Caitlin. You were certainly on the program too, I recall. So there's clearly a movement, and this webinar that it's on our homepage, the National Press. I think this conversation pairs really well with the National Press Club webinar that's on our homepage now, because that was the first. Because I've heard signals many times, and from some of the people there and others, about the idea that a generational shift is kind of a foregone conclusion. It's not a matter of if the practice is going to change, but how and how best to advance it, and when people not practicing more progressive practices or solutions or prevention-based practices are going to get on board, and we can help them with how. And the idea that it was kind of already determined was pretty exciting to me, and the panel was pretty convincing.
I think that's, we talked about this in that webinar last week too, but getting editors on board, getting TV in the room on this, I think is a really important step. So I am heartened to hear that you've feel like there's progress being made there.
No doubt. Was there a second half of that question? There was.
Oh no, it was you answered it, but it was that either do you feel like you're preaching to the choir, and or is there a movement? Are people making change? I think that's where we're going to leave it today, folks. Thank you so much for joining and for tuning in. If you joined late, there is a recording of this available at healthjournalism.org in just a few hours. And I really want to thank our presenters for taking the time to share their expertise and their perspective on this. AHCJ will continue to bring you webinars on a variety of health topics as a perk of your membership. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and take care.